it's all subjective.
It's supposed to be, yeah.
You know.
I mean, I understand how like young people get into a thing where if they don't have anything else that they can identify with, and they go, these records and these people that listen to those records who are my peers or I want to be my peers, I want to be part of that group. I understand the mentality, but I was never like that.
I wasn't either.
But I understand people are like that. So I do find it sounds to me like it was a bit more like that in the UK, because of the things that were going on culturally with young people, cynical, and
the punk thing. You know, the punk thing was wiping out. You know, Deep Purple and Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. Well, but you know, Nirvana, Black Sabbath were the uncoolest group in the world. And then Kurt Cobain said they're one of my major influences, and suddenly they were hip again.
Yeah.
And then now Black Sabbath have been hugely appreciated as one of the classic rock bands.
Yeah.
You know, ever.
Yeah. I mean, the only time I've ever seen Sabbath was actually kind of in recent years, and they were a co-bill with when Chris Cornell was still alive, with co-bill with Soundgarden.
Oh yeah.
Because that was the same audience.
Isn't that funny? You
like
know?
The people that
grunge,
like them, were like, well, no, Sabbath is really cool.
And grunge really came along and kind of wiped out my group.
Yeah,
you know, right. Because we were sort of in this sort of guitar-y, semi-psychedelic.
Like you weren't super hard.
No,
but you were harder than most kind of airwave music.
Yeah,
but not. So there were a few groups that were like that, that kind of fell in that cracks.
Yeah.
You know, the Replacements were a bit like that.
Yeah.
Like they were like proto Nirvana.
Yeah.
But they were too heavy for the airwaves at the time, too kind of edgy, but they wrote great songs.
Yeah. Like Us and Echo and the Bunnymen and the Chameleons and all those great bands, they all sort of kind of like weren't hip anymore. They weren't that great English hip scene that came to America.
Yeah.
Because we got Nirvana now. You know.
But at least the thing that happened, back to the punk thing that I think is really interesting is, and a bit, sometimes I'm a bit annoyed by it. Sometimes I'm kind of, I find it really just an interesting phenomenon, because in a way the punk thing in the UK is very different from how it affected the States, because hardcore in the States, hardcore bands in the States, you needed to know how to play, because everything was fast and furious, and like tightness was kind of a desired quality.
Yes.
And it was kind of social. It was definitely socially driven, but it wasn't fashion driven.
Right.
Whereas I feel like a lot of the British punk thing, I mean, people I know shoot me for saying this, but it's quite fashion driven.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a coincidence the Pistols met in Vivienne Westwood's shop.
Right.
It's fashion driven. It was like there was an aesthetic thing about it, and it wasn't about the playing in a way. And it was cool that it gave people the opportunity to be like, you don't have to have studied guitar to be in a band, which is a great thing.
Which is great.
But the negative thing was it made it that if you had studied guitar, it was something a bit naff.
Yeah, sure.
It was like, oh, well, this is not cool. If you know what you're doing, if you know how to read notes, it's muso, and that term,
But in their defense,
it's just funny.
But in their defense, which I prefer over American punk hardcore, is they wrote better songs.
Better songs, yeah, and more aesthetics.
Yeah,
more of an idea.
Whether you're
listening
to the Motors, or Wire, or even like Generation X. They all had the Pretenders. They all had great songs.
Yeah, that's right.
And whenever I listened to that, I was never into that American hardcore punk thing because I could never hear the songs.
Yeah, like if you listen to a Black Flag record, there's no songs.
Yeah, I wasn't interested in the social movement.
Yeah.
I didn't live in LA, and I didn't care about the American social movement.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't really care about the English punk movement either because I was happy to listen to Steve Hillage and the Sex Pistols.
Right.
And I thought they were both great.
Yeah.
But the thing is about those bands is, as I say, there was Airport by the Motors, fantastic song, and there's so Eddie and the Hot Rods, Do Anything You Want to Do. There's so many you can just list. The Buzzcocks.
Yeah.
There's so many songs you can just list, and so many bands that had really great tunes. XTC.
Yeah, XTC were great. They were like really. I remember there was like a couple kind of odd cable, early American cable TV shows that played music music videos, the very, very early versions of it that was not MTV. And I remember seeing XTC on something like late at night and being like, what is this? This is great.
Yeah,
you know?
it's great. I have all of their records. I was always a big fan. But on the other hand, you know, you talk about these, this is the thing, you talk about these things. I went into a shop, I was working with Paul Simpson from the Wild Swans in Liverpool. He was originally in the Teardrop Explodes, another great band. And I was working with him. I walked into a shop in Liverpool, and they had for £6.99, they had whatever it is, they had Creedence. They had, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. They had a brand new version, a brand new copy of Disraeli Gears.
Wow.
Right? Disraeli Gears. £6.99, vinyl, brand new. I've got the English one on Reaction and the American one on Atco, but this was a brand new copy of a 1967 classic album with the classic artwork and the songs and the playing and the singing and the arrangements. And I was thinking, wow, how is that not as good as anything in the new wave punk era, as far as the attitude, the sounds, the sonics, you know. So they played a bit better. Yeah. But I was comparing the songs. Yeah. You know. Yeah. And there's this kind of like English songwriting thing going on. Yeah. In that punk era, despite them sort of saying, it's just, despite some of them pretending they couldn't play. Yeah. Well, and they actually could.
Well, because they were all listening to great records.
Yeah, they're listening to great records.
So, you know.
And this record, you know, fantastic. And I could put Cream and an XTC in the same bag, in a way. You know, Cream and XTC, what? But I can put them in the same bag. You know, the XTC played great. They had great songs. They were interesting. They were catchy. They were good musicians. Yeah. Cream, interesting, catchy, good musicians. Yeah. Great songs. I mean, what's the difference?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's right.
You know.
Absolutely. Just kind of generational differences of like style. But...
Yeah. One's got a more flowery shirt than the other. Yeah. You know. Like Julian Cope. I always loved Julian Cope's records. You know, anything Teardrop Explodes, I always really liked. Echo and the Bunnymen, I loved Echo and the Bunnymen. Although they were so kind of hip and their haircuts and style was kind of crucial for the time. Yeah. The albums were great, the songs on the albums were great. Ian McCulloch's voice, Will's guitar playing, Pete DeFreitas' drumming was different, Les's bass playing was really forceful. You know, and it was just, everything was fantastic about them. Yeah. Despite them supposed to be from an era where we're not supposed to be playing very well, they all played amazingly well. Yeah. They might not have gone and known their scales. They had
a lot of style and were yeah, it's funny because that's a band I didn't know much about. I only heard like the hits that came on the radio. Yeah. I guess probably whenever that was in their arc of their career.
Yeah, there's one there, look. But right that's the back of one of the records. Yeah.
But we were in the van recently driving somewhere, and one of the guys put an album on. I think Stuart put an album on while we were driving somewhere, and I was like, man, this is really cool. I was kind of, you know, I was in the middle of like listening to this podcast and I had my headphones off, and I was like, what is this? And I looked down and saw it was like an old Bunnyman. And I was like, oh wow, I didn't know they sounded like that. Yeah. So it was cool. Yeah. I don't know what record that was. I need to ask him.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of super cool records by then, especially the first 5. You know, we toured America with them, which was a big break for us because their audience really liked us in America. Yeah. Their audience really liked us. We toured with them in 85, 86, something like that. And they had a compilation album, Songs to Learn and Sing, and we just released Heyday. And we got a lot of following from that tour. That was one of those things where you open for somebody and the reason for doing it really worked.
Right. Did you guys know each other, or was it was just purely a business thing?
It was just somebody sort of went, these two would be good together.
Yeah.
Unlike when we toured with Duran Duran in England in 1982, which was a disaster.
Okay.
You know, it's like, oh God, who thought of that? You know, put it in front of an audience that's going to hate us instead of an audience that's going to like us.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it was all screaming girls.
Yeah.
We came on stage and it was like, who are these guys? Where's John?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Those kind of mismatched support.
Oh
pairs,
God!
man.
But in the '60s, it didn't matter. There's another thing,
you see
right?
those posters, you're like
Hendrix and
you're like Miles, Steve Miller Band, and like you know,
the Monkees and Hendrix.
Yeah. And you're like, wow.
That's great, isn't it? I love that about those days, though. So nobody really knew kind of what they were doing,
right?
Or they hadn't sort of been given
there wasn't a formula quite yet.
Yeah, they hadn't sorted it out yet. They hadn't turned it into genres yet. It was just.
Well, it wasn't an industry, quote unquote.
No, it wasn't.
It was like a couple weirdos that figured out, had enough business acumen to get a bunch of people in a room.
Yeah, that's right.
But it wasn't really, you know.
Yeah. Somebody donates. People donate things to the archive. Somebody donated that. The All Things Must Pass mega box set.
That's cool.
Yeah.
What a beautiful record.
Yeah.
Do I know this record?
I can hear Tommy James in the background playing on the.
I don't know this record.
No. Dark Horse.
I've seen that title, but I don't know it.
Yeah, well, this is the problem with coming in here. You need to come in here and camp out for 6 months.
Yeah. So you just kind of started, like, when did this become like, okay, now I have a ridiculous amount of records, and this is what people call a record collection?
Well, I took my records with me to Australia when I went to Australia, and I had one tea chest full of records. And then because I was in a band, and I was getting wages, I used to spend my wages on records.
Right.
And that turned into a pretty big collection there. And
Back in the days when the airlines didn't skin you for your suitcase being too heavy. You can't buy vinyl on tour anymore.
That's right. I'd walk on the plane with 2 bags of records, which with this, and you know how heavy that many records is.
Yeah.
2 bags, and nobody stopped me.
Yeah.
You know.
You could have just.
Yeah, I could have tipped the plane up, but nobody stopped me. So I was able to, transport records around, and they weren't that expensive as well. And when CDs came out, they sort of became really cheap. Yeah. Everybody was selling their vinyl collections.
And there was no eBay, so it wasn't like somebody saying that copy of that record for all the world to see costs this, and everybody decides their record costs that.
Yeah, that's right. So consequently, it just built up and built up. And when everybody else was staying in the hotel, I was running around the record stores in Chicago and Minneapolis and buying a bunch of records, putting them in my suitcase and bringing them home.
I mean, that's a thing that I say for, almost everything collectible. Like I was saying, like I love this kind of, I wouldn't call it a study because it's really haphazard, just my inner thoughts about like observing collectability. It really, unfortunately, the internet really, mostly for the negative, changed so much about collecting things. So like even we're talking about like with records.
What you mean? You didn't have the serendipitous moment of wow.
Well, what it meant is that somebody on one side of the planet could say that what they have is worth X.
Yeah.
And somebody completely somewhere else will say, well, now mine is worth that because somebody in Florida is selling theirs for that.
Well,
and what that does is it kind of started killing the idea of finding something that is like where you go like, hey, this copy of Concert for Bangladesh, I've not actually ever seen it in the box set before, and I'm going to pick that up. And then there's nobody kind of saying, well, no, that's worth X or Y. It's where it is. But now, if you go, you're afraid to show too much interest in it. If somebody's selling it because they'll just go on their phone and go like, oh, in Japan this sells for $180.
Yeah, that's right.
180, 200.
Yeah.
Right. You know, whereas before the internet, you know, it'd just be whatever it was. And, you know, sometimes I would overcharge you and sometimes somebody might undercharge you, but it wasn't, there was no, you know, and people weren't just kind of buying them. People were collecting them, but they weren't, and people were certainly buying them to resell them, but it wasn't the same kind of resellers market for anything as it is once you could put things on eBay or
I mean, my record collection is probably worth $1 million, you know. It's like by the standards of the eBay and the internet. But not that I wouldn't sell my concert for Bangladesh for anything, you know.
But yeah, it's like you have the same things, but it's like their value kind of changed probably exponentially.
With booklet, you know, with booklet.
Yeah.
Wow. Jimi Hendrix has fallen on the floor. Yeah, that was a box. See, that's John Lennon box set. I got that from EMI in the 80s in Australia.
Wow.
Because you know we were on EMI and one day they said the new Lennon box has come out. You guys can have a copy of it if you want.
That's great.
You know. So I've had that for years. Yeah.
I was just talking to somebody about there were a few. It was because with Quincy Jones having passed away a few days ago. And there were some records that my dad had. He had a couple of Quincy Jones records that kind of predated his Thriller stuff, kind of like his later kind of arranger work.
Oh yeah.
And then one of them was kind of a late 70s record called I Heard That. And that record, so that was like around, I would say that record's something like 78, 79, I think. And John Lennon Double Fantasy, which was 1980 when it came out.
Yeah.
And those records, I was just coming out of middle school, going into freshman year of high school. And those kind of gave me the first ideas of like what a studio musician was. Because I was starting to play a lot, and this idea of like looking at a record and going like, oh, well, this isn't a band. This is like, they hired this guy or this woman to play this instrument on this song on this record,
right?
And I started to understand like, oh, studio musician. So like, I was looking at Double Fantasy and kind of going, oh, Andy Newmark, but isn't that the same guy that plays on those Sly Stone records? I thought he was Sly Stone's drummer, but
that's right,
he's a studio drummer. He plays on a lot of records.
So is that where you sort of got the idea of that you could be a session guy?
Yeah, it was the first time I came to be aware that was something that people did.
Yeah.
And so I remember just like looking at Double Fantasy and like not even knowing what some things were, like what the fuck is a hammered dulcimer?
Yeah, right.
Like, and kind of, this, somebody plays that and somebody plays this other thing. Or I remember like some of the older records where it's like when they still called it Fender bass.
Oh, yeah,
I'm like, well, what's a Fender bass? I know what a bass is. I know what an upright bass is. What's a Fender bass? But I didn't realize it was this old.
But you've also got to get, you've got to get in their address books as well, haven't you? That's the other thing. You've got to be, having the skills is one thing.
Sure.
Being called is another.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But it's great that you've got to play with all these different amazing bands. You know, from Arno to Tindersticks to Jeff Beck to like as we talked about before, different things.
Yeah, I've got to play with a lot of really, really great people. Really just, and it really. It's my favorite thing. My favorite thing is, some people are driven by playing live. I like playing live, obviously, but to me, walking into a studio and there's music that needs to kind of be brought to life, and it's not formed yet of what the bass part is or what my kit part is or whether the verse works there or that whole thing of bringing it together,
arranging it
and arranging it. That's really what I live for. You know, I mean, I like playing live, but to me, I really only kind of get a huge rush from playing live, like playing improvisational music, because you're creating something new.
Yeah,
you know, like
right.
Playing, you know, like being on tour and stuff, and you play the same music every night, and it's great fun, and it's a blessing to be able to do it. But really, the drive to me is like creating something new, something of going in a studio.
Who are your favorite drummers then? Who are your top 200 favorite drummers?
Gosh, exactly.
Because I have a thing on my website.
Yeah.
My top 147 guitarists.
Exactly. It's like then it would be hard to kind of even narrow that down. Yeah, because some of them aren't even drummers. I mean, some of them are. You know, I learned as much from. Like I remember like being really obsessed with one record that taught me a lot about phrasing, and Bill Evans at the Village Vanguard. Something about the way Bill Evans and that bassist Scott LaFaro played together.
Yeah.
More so than the drums on the record.
Plus the drummer's probably going.
Yeah, he's a brilliant. Paul Moshan, he was a brilliant drummer.
But those guys are anchoring it, right?
But there was something about the way they phrase things. Yeah. And he's playing a lot of standards, so songs which you know the melody, but he's extrapolated and taken it to this other place. And I just remember I used to kind of sit around and try to follow what he was doing around the time, and so that taught me a lot about as much about drums as the drums did. And then I'd listen to Ringo and go like, well, how does he get that to sound like that? And then just so many people that was playing I love. Charlie Watts who's playing I love so much. Bonham was a massive influence on me. And then all the masters, Blakey and Elvin and Tony Williams. I'm still obsessed with Tony Williams. I've been in a Tony Williams rabbit hole. I've gotten to with him. I go through eras. Like right now, I'm in Tony Williams '80s records. Like some of the records that even people kind of don't even think about. But he's playing because he evolved his playing a lot over the years. So he just kind of changed the way he tuned and the way he played and his approach. And like I've kind of gotten into this kick. So there's always there's so many people.